Lecture 74, Joseph Conrad.
Going up that river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted upon the earth and the big trees were kings. So says Marlowe, the seafaring narrator of Joseph Conrad's short novel, Heart of Darkness. Marlowe is sitting with 4 other men on the deck of a cruising yawl that is anchored not far from London in the River Thames. To while away the time while they wait for the turn of the tide, Marlowe has ventured to tell a story about a mysterious and frightening voyage. Not a voyage out to sea, but up the Congo River into the heart of the Belgian Congo, though neither the river nor the country are named in the story. Early in the story, Marlowe tells us that as a child he had a passion for maps, and they fired his urge to savor all the glories of exploration. What he loved, he says, were the big blank spaces on the map, terra incognita, the unknown land. The blankest space of all that he found on the map was a big white patch that has been filled in since his boyhood with rivers, lakes, and names, and thereby become a place of darkness. Now, here's a paradox. Why should the discovery of facts about this previously unknown space make it a place of darkness? Why has it become a place of darkness? We won't know the answer to this question until we read the whole story. But we soon enough learn that whatever we do know about this huge and barely explored continent is overwhelmed by what we still don't know about it. At one point in the story, shortly before Marlowe starts up the river from the central station, a young, mercenary, scheming first-class agent voices his contempt for the idealistic aims of another agent named Mr. Kurtz. According to the cynical young schemer, Kurtz is an emissary of pity and science and progress and devil knows what else. Since Kurtz is also renowned for gathering as much ivory as all the other agents put together, this agent of the central station clearly sees him as a rival, a threat to his own advancement in what Marlowe simply calls the company, actually a Belgian trading company operating in the Congo. As this first-class agent jabbers on one evening about his petty ambitions, Marlowe marvels at the inscrutable majesty of the world around them, at the smell of primeval mud, at the high stillness of primeval forest, at the impenetrable density of the vegetation, and at the endless glittering of the great river flowing by without a murmur. All this, says Marlowe, was great, expectant, mute, while the man jabbered about himself. I wondered whether the stillness on the face of the immensity looking at us too were meant as an appeal or as a menace. What were we who had strayed in here? Could we handle that big, dumb thing, or would it handle us? In 1898, when the 41-year-old Joseph Conrad sat down to write this tale of a voyage into the darkness of something like a prehistoric time, he was already well known as an English novelist, but he had reached that position by a route as winding as the River Congo itself. In a letter to a cousin written en route to the Congo in May of 1890, he called himself a Polish nobleman cased in British tar. That encapsulates his unique condition. Conrad's early life was hard. Christened Joseph Theodor Conrad Korzeniowski in the Ukraine, which had once belonged to Poland, he was descended on both sides of his family from landed Polish aristocracy, what the Poles call szlachta. But when Joseph was not quite 4, his father, a leading Polish nationalist, was arrested and jailed for secretly plotting against Russia. 6 months later, he was exiled to Vologda in northwest Russia, where Joseph and his mother lived with him. But she lasted less than a year, and when the boy caught a series of illnesses, he often had to be sent away for treatment. In spite of all these setbacks and hardships, Joseph learned a great deal from his father, who was not just a leading Polish nationalist, but also a literary man, a poet and translator of Shakespeare and Victor Hugo. Learning to read and write at the age of 5, Joseph read voraciously thrived under the tutelage of his father, and was well on his way to learning French by the age of 7. Now here's a question. Did Joseph ever get any lessons in English? We don't know. But his father knew English well enough to translate Shakespeare. Little Joseph read Shakespeare at his father's urging, and this same father wrote of the 8-year-old Joseph at one point, "I teach him all I know myself." If it's reasonable to guess that he might have taught Joseph a bit of English along with the French, then Apollo Korzeniowski deserves at least some credit for the magisterial command of English that his son would later acquire. But Apollo never lived to see that achievement. Though he was allowed to return to Poland with his son in 1867, when Joseph was 10, he died less than 2 years later, and the boy was placed with a succession of guardians, leading up to the most important of all, his maternal uncle, Tadeusz Bobrowski, who bankrolled the boy well into adulthood. Tadeusz did not want the boy to go to sea, but given Joseph's chronically poor health and his lackluster performance in school, his uncle relented. So in October of 1874, the 16-year-old Joseph left Poland for Marseille, where he got to know a rich collection of Bohemians, and then worked on a series of voyages in French ships. At one point, just after he turned 20, his gullibility and recklessness nearly cost him his life. After losing nearly 4,000 francs in a series of misadventures and finding himself unable to get a job on a ship, he shot himself in the chest. Luckily, the bullet damaged no vital organ, and just as luckily, news of his plight brought his uncle, Tadeusz, rushing from Poland to Marseille. Besides settling all of Joseph's debts, Uncle Tadeusz generously raised his allowance to 2,400 francs a year. For all his defects, his hypersensitivity, his conceit, his excitability, the 20-year-old Joseph struck his uncle as a young man who had already come to know seamanship, and the uncle ventured the guess that a real man might still be made of him. Neither Joseph nor his uncle realized it at the time, but this whole disaster indirectly played a crucial part in the making of Conrad as an English writer. For at the end of it all, he and his uncle decided that he should join the English merchant marine. According to Conrad, it was on an English coal schooner in the summer of 1878, just a few months after he had tried to kill himself, that he started picking up the language that he would soon make his own. "In that craft," Conrad wrote, "I began to learn English." Thereafter, he began rising in rank and turning into a British writer. In 1886, at the age of 29, he became a British subject, qualified as a master mariner, and made his first attempt at writing fiction. 3 years later, after 3 more voyages to the South Pacific, he had not only become a captain, but had launched himself into literature by starting work on his first novel, Almayer's Folly. In 1895, 2 years after Joseph decided to sail no more, Almayer's Folly appeared under his new pen name, Joseph Conrad. The real man that Uncle Tadeusz presciently foresaw was now a real English writer. Let us now return to Heart of Darkness, which Conrad finished in February of 1899. Though it first appeared that year in 3 successive issues of Blackwood's magazine, he revised it for publication in a book called Youth, a Narrative, and 2 Other Stories in 1902. It's this revised version of the story that I quoted from at the beginning of this lecture, and to which I now return. But to return fully equipped for our voyage up the Congo River, I want to look more closely at Conrad's own experiences of the Congo in the summer and fall of 1890. Like Marlowe, Conrad as a boy loved maps. Putting his finger one day on the blank space in the middle of Africa that represented unknown territory, he boldly declared, "When I grow up, I shall go there." Almost 25 years later, on September 1, 1890, Conrad fulfilled his wish by landing at Stanley Falls, the last town that could be reached by steamboat on the upper Congo. Since Stanley Falls was an important outpost of the government of the Congo Free State and a trading center for the Belgian company that hired Conrad, it was one of the many places that had begun to fill in the blank of his boyhood map. Yet it was also a place where the would-be civilizing aims of enlightened Europeans met the barbarity of the Arabs, one of whose camps stood on the river just above the falls at the time of Conrad's visit. While the Arabs had come to Central Africa for slaves, the Belgian company pretended to hire Ames. According to its propaganda at home, it set out to trade with the natives and civilize them. The company that hired Conrad to command a wood-fired steamer on the Congo River was founded to serve the grand design of King Leopold II of Belgium, who sought to colonize and dominate the Congo, to monopolize its trade and exploit its huge resources for what sounded like the noblest of motives. Leopold aimed, he said, to liberate the natives of the Congo from slavery and also from barbarities such as cannibalism, which native tribes inflicted on each other. It's barely possible that this idealistic goal of civilizing the natives may have played some part in drawing Conrad to the Congo. At the outset of his story, Marlowe says that the conquest of the earth may become something more than wholesale robbery and murder if, and only if, the enterprise of conquest is redeemed by an idea, by which he means a moral aim that is more than a sentimental pretense. Kurtz fascinates Marlowe because he seems to promise this kind of redemption. Having learned before taking his boat up the river that Kurtz, the chief of the inner station, had come out to the Congo equipped with moral ideas of some sort, Marlowe is eager to see just what those ideas will produce on the ground. But if Conrad himself had any illusions about the nobility of the Belgian company's enterprise or the excitement of taking part in it, those illusions were quickly dispelled. For one thing, he never got to command a steamboat of his own, only to watch another commander at work on the 28-day voyage from Leopoldville to Stanley Falls, and then to pilot the boat for about a week on the way home when the commander got sick. Conrad himself was ravaged by sickness. On the river, he suffered fever 4 times in 2 months. On the long tramp back from Leopold to Matadi, he had to be carried most of the way and nearly died of dysentery. Even in times of health, he was sick of the people that he met, as we can see from a letter that he wrote to his Aunt Marguerite on September 26, 1890, just after steaming back from Stanley Falls to Leopoldville. "Everything here," he writes to his aunt, "is repellent to me. Men and things, but men above all." Now, early on in his Congo trip, he actually met a couple of good men, but in late September 1890, he sees no one that he likes and no one who likes him. All he sees at the end of his round-trip voyage up the Congo River is the thick gray fog of dismay. "Decidedly," he writes, "I regret having come here. I even regret it bitterly." Still more, he regretted having signed a contract that tied him to the Congo for 3 years. But in the end, he stayed for just 6 months, like most of the men who signed such contracts. One other thing is worth noting about Conrad's initial response to the Congo, as distinct from his profoundly meditative recreation of it in fiction. Though he soon discovered the greed, duplicity, and stupidity of the white traders, he did not at first realize how cruelly they exploited the natives. 2 of his diaries record, sometimes quite vividly, his impressions of the land and the river and the people that he met, even of dead bodies he occasionally passed. But the diaries say nothing about the sufferings of the natives or of what he calls in the letter to his aunt, black savages. One entry is particularly revealing. On July 5, 1890, a few days into the tramp from Matadi to Leopoldville, he fell into a mud puddle. "Beastly," he writes, and then adds, "the fault of the man that carried me." Clearly, he didn't care that whites carried nothing while black porters carried everything, or that the porters had to carry the white men across bogs and rivers in hammocks. What bothered him was that a bearer's slip dumped him in mud. Yet one word in this entry distinguishes it from the kind of thing that almost any other irritated white man would have written about a clumsy native in a situation like this. Surprisingly enough, Conrad speaks of him not as a savage or beast or anything else contemptible, but simply as a man. 8 years later, when Conrad turned the memories and diaries of his Congo experience into a work of fiction, he set out to show the humanity of the natives and thus to challenge the lingering assumption that blacks were subhuman, hardly more than beasts. As the steamboat passed a village on its way up the river, Marlowe says, a burst of yells and clapping hands and a whirl of limbs would greet the voyagers, leaving them to wonder at prehistoric man. The earth seemed unearthly, says Marlowe. We are accustomed to look upon the shackled face of a conquered monster, but there you could look at a thing monstrous and free. Well, that was the worst of it. This suspicion of their not being inhuman. They howled and leaped and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours, the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Great literature crosses barriers of time, space, and personality. In Moby Dick, the somewhat shy and diffident Ishmael finds himself suddenly thrilled by the sheer audacity of Captain Ahab's quest for the great white whale. Marlowe is likewise thrilled by the humanity of the natives, who for him embody the prehistoric truth of nature, truth stripped of its cloak of time. But Ahab's spirit of epic daring, which he himself articulates in a language of captivating eloquence, is not the same as the raw, inarticulate vitality of Conrad's natives, who for the most part are made to seem human only in the most elementary sense of the word. Conrad's story thus reflects the theory of evolution newly propounded by Charles Darwin in two major books, The Origin of Species, 1859, and The Descent of Man, 1871. If, as Darwin argued, human beings descended or evolved from primitive forms of life that gradually became more complex and intelligent, the natives of Africa could be seen as exemplifying a primitive state of humanity. Insofar as Conrad's story reflects this view of African natives, it has provoked the ugly charge of racism. For the natives in this story never speak a language that is said to be comprehensible, and Marlowe, the narrator, makes no effort to understand tribal culture or to explain the significance of tribal rituals, which at one point he simply treats as fiendish. But Conrad is not an anthropologist or an Africanist. He's a European writer bent on unmasking the hypocrisy of European colonizers and bent on showing just how easily the cloak of civilization can be ripped from the back of a white man who ventures into the jungle. In other words, if King Leopold aimed to bring the light of civilization into the wilds of Africa, Conrad set out to reveal the heart of darkness that lurks within that light, especially when it's embodied by someone who sees himself as a white god of wisdom in a forest of black worshippers. Primitivism, of course, can take several distinct forms. On the one hand, it can signify a vital freedom from the constraints and inhibitions of civilization, as with the natives that Marlowe sees when he is en route to the Congo, natives paddling a boat through the surf. They had bone, muscle, says Marlowe, a wild vitality, an intense energy of movement that was as natural and true as the surf along the coast. But the dark underside of this wild vitality is the uninhibited savagery of murderous aggression, primitivism at its darkest. The most original thing about Conrad's story is that it discovers this kind of primitivism not in the so-called savages of Africa, but in the white Europeans who have supposedly come out to civilize them. Writing about a Belgian company in Africa, creating a narrator who can speak both English and French, ranging from the developed world to the undeveloped world, Conrad could be called a global writer, a man who takes the world for his beat. But insofar as global culture entails colonization, the global imposition of European rule and European values, this book takes a radically critical view of it. At the turn of the 19th century, when Conrad's novel appeared, imperialism was at its peak. England and Europe between them dominated most of Africa and India. Conrad's story takes aim at this domination. It originates from his experience with just one Belgian colony, but it implicitly attacks the whole imperial project and the globalizing assumption that developed nations are uniquely equipped to civilize the world. In Conrad's novel, The civilizing mission of the Europeans is personified and articulated by Kurtz, a man of reputedly exceptional talents, who has been chief of the Inner Station, the fictional counterpart of Stanley Falls, the farthest point that a steamer can travel on the Congo River. Marlowe learns about Kurtz at the Central Station, the fictional version of Leopoldville. When Marlowe reaches the Central Station after a long tramp, he learns that Kurtz is sick, that he must be relieved, and that Marlowe must pilot a steamer up the river to him. Unlike Conrad himself, who commanded a steamer for just a few days on the way back from Stanley Falls, Marlowe commands the steamer all the way up the river, and the story he tells about his voyage is essentially a story about his quest for Kurtz, a man whose grand design of civilizing the natives somehow leads him into barbarous acts. This isn't just a matter of adopting native customs or going native, imitating the so-called savages. Though Marlowe shows no respect for tribal culture, the natives of this story are not brutes. For the most part, they are cruelly exploited victims of white colonizers. And with one of the natives, the helmsman of his steamboat, Marlowe develops a bond of partnerships that he feels most keenly and poignantly at the very moment when the man is fatally shot by an arrow in the course of an ambush. But Marlowe cares most of all about Kurtz, for Kurtz combines the greatest hope of achieving good with the greatest capacity for doing evil. Long before Marlowe meets Kurtz, he learns that Kurtz is considered a remarkable agent, and not just because he sends in as much ivory as all the other agents put together. By reputation, at least, Kurtz is a shining product of European education. He supposedly combines the sensitivity of an artist, the learning of a scholar, and the eloquence of a spellbinding orator. When Marlowe talks to the scheming young agent in his room at the Central Station, he sees a small sketch in oils showing a stately, draped, and blindfolded woman bearing a lighted torch against a background so dark it is almost black. Painted by Kurtz, the picture represents Kurtz's intended, his fiancée. But it also represents the sacred fire of civilization that Kurtz yearns to bring into the heart of darkness. Since Marlowe has just told us about a grass shed at the station full of cheap merchandise that burst into a blaze one evening, we might wonder just how valuable is the sacred fire of civilization. Marlowe himself is appalled to learn that his aunt got him his job on the river by telling the company he would be something like an emissary of light. But unlike the scheming first-class agent, Marlowe doesn't despise the idealism of Kurtz. On the contrary, he wants to see what Kurtz will do with that idealism in the depths of the jungle, with absolute authority over the natives there and no other white man around to question or overrule his commands. The source of Kurtz's authority, for good or evil, lies in his voice. So the story that Conrad writes about Kurtz begins by asking us to envision a live storyteller, Marlowe, talking to a group of 4 listeners on a yawl as the sun sets and twilight gradually turns, quite literally, into darkness. Now, we've seen first-person narrative in British fiction before, notably in Dickens' Great Expectations, where Pip tells his own story in his own words. But remember, Pip writes his story for readers that, of course, he cannot see. Marlowe tells his story to listeners that he can and does see until darkness envelops them and they can experience nothing of him but his voice. The novel as a whole works to draw us gradually into this voice and into the heart of darkness. Built like a series of Chinese boxes, the novel actually has 2 first-person narrators. First, an unnamed writer who describes Marlowe sitting on the yawl and talking to 4 other men, then Marlowe himself. So the first narrator, an external narrator, introduces us to Marlowe, an interior narrator, who in turn takes us with him into the Congo, up the river from the Central Station to the Inner Station, and into the heart of Kurtz. The conflict between Kurtz's noble intentions and the darkness of that heart is nowhere more vividly dramatized than in the report he wrote for the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs. Essentially, That report argued that because of their vastly superior development, white men can assume with blacks the might of a deity and can therefore exercise over them a power for good, practically unbounded. But at the end of what Marlowe calls this moving appeal to every altruistic sentiment comes a note evidently scrawled much later in a trembling hand, a note that blazed like a flash of lightning. "Exterminate all the brutes!" So much for Kurtz's magnificent eloquence. So much for his lofty idealism. In the words that blaze like a flash of lightning, we see precisely what becomes of the sacred fire. Far worse than the blaze that consumed the grass shed full of cheap merchandise, it turns into something like hell on earth. Driven by his voracity for ivory and a sense of his own divine omnipotence, Kurtz came to believe that he owned not only all the ivory of the Congo, but everything in it, and that anyone who opposed him could be sacrificed. Everything, says Marlowe, belonged to him, but that was a trifle. The thing was to know what he belonged to, how many powers of darkness had claimed him for their own. He had taken a high seat among the devils of the land. Since Marlowe elsewhere speaks of native rituals as fiendish, this passage could simply imply that Kurtz had taken his place within a tribal culture of devil worship and then impersonated a devil himself. I wouldn't want to argue this myself, because the novel makes no serious attempt to tell us what the natives believe on their own. But whether or not the novel identifies tribal culture with diabolic powers, the fate of Kurtz exemplifies much more than a simple reverse of evolutionary progress. Kurtz doesn't simply shed the drapery of civilization to revive a primitive self. He uses, or rather abuses, the gifts of civilization, above all his eloquence, to feed his insatiable lust for ivory and sacrificial victims. Surely this helps to explain Kurtz's dying words, the very last productions of a once grandiloquent voice that has shriveled to a whisper. To Marlowe, he says on his deathbed, "The horror, the horror." Those final 4 words of Kurtz have provoked many more words of interpretation. First from Marlowe within the story, and then from Conrad's many critics. At the end of the story, when Marlowe pays a visit to Kurtz's intended, he actually lies about those final words, even though he has earlier said that he detests lies. Here's one of the many puzzles in the story, a puzzle that I leave you to work out for yourself. For only you as the reader can judge how much of Marlowe's story is true, how truthfully it represents man's capacity to delude himself, to sabotage his own noblest ideals, to undo the work of civilization itself, even as he claims to be spreading it. "My task," wrote Conrad, "is to make you hear, to make you feel. It is, before all, to make you see." In reporting and interpreting the last words of Kurtz, Marlowe tries to communicate something of what this madman has finally discovered about himself. Yet in lying about those words to Kurtz's intended, Marlowe implicitly confirms what he tells us earlier, which is that your own reality is precisely what no other man can know. In the end, Marlowe is not just admitting the impossibility of explaining Kurtz to his intended, but of explaining his own experience to anyone else in the whole world. In the middle of telling his story at one point, Marlowe says of Kurtz to his listeners, "Do you see him? Do you see the story? It seems to me that I am trying to tell you a dream. It is impossible to convey the life sensation of any one epoch of one's existence, that which makes its truth, its meaning. We live as we dream. Alone. We live as we dream alone." This could be taken as the creed of modernism, a way of thinking that emerges in the first part of the 20th century. Like Heart of Darkness, modernism challenges the authority of all the assumptions, conventions, and institutions that traditionally regulate our lives and bind us together. Modernism spotlights the isolated self. It treats the individual as a creature of radical subjectivity, caught up in a dreamlike sense of unreality, something incommunicable because it is fundamentally irrational, or as Marlowe calls it at one point, absurd. We will see more of this condition in works such as Franz Kafka's Trial, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which exemplifies what has been called the theater of the absurd. So in Heart of Darkness, Conrad initiates us into the world of modernism.